Hello, everybody. I hope everyone's having a beautiful day. So my name is Dr. Daniel Page, but you can just call me Dan or Daniel. I'm gonna be right frank with you. I've tried to give this talk several times at this point, and I hope you understand that this talk is a very difficult one for me to have to give because I professionally worked in inclusion myself, and I'm not to be confused with the subject at hand, traditional inclusion practices. In addition, I'm directly affected by many of the policies that we're going to be discussing here today. So I'm hoping that you'll take into consideration the nature of this talk and also the concerns at hand. So I'll be trying my best to separate myself so that we can focus on the topic at hand. So I see this talk as one that is not just an academic talk, it is a necessity that we discuss this because people have been discussing it, but it's getting to the point where the silence I am seeing among leadership at Canadian universities is dismal. Is dismal. I think that it's very important that the public, other academics, they start talking about this more frankly. So we're going to talk a bit about DIE, so-called diversity, inclusion, and equity. So these are just words, just to be frank. I'm talking about what that is a little bit. It's not a core part of this talk. It's just to give us some framing so we know a little bit about it. Then I'll talk about a framework using a bit about optimizations and theory of algorithms to talk about determining exclusion. I'll be talking about preferential and restricted hiring in relation to this, just to give a kind of a case study. Then I'll be talking about some of the research I've been doing for the last 5 years, observing and documenting computer science job ads. So this talk is targeted towards STEM, so specifically about science. So I consider this talk very important because science plays a key role in innovation in our country, in Canada. So must be stressed. I'm going to be talking the most like kind of meat and potatoes things of this talk is what we call a DIE pledge. So I'll be defining what these are and what they are in relation to something called, I'm going to be referring to as academic culling. So this is actually the direct threat of academic plurality at universities by namely targeting the intellectual autonomy of academics. So I'll be showing you my results and ultimately giving you a summary. I must stress that at the end of this talk, you can go check out the data sets. I have actually posted them publicly. So there's a preliminary data set that'll be available at the link on the last slide for this talk. In addition, this talk and the slides will be available on the same page. So about me. So now I said already that I was not going to talk a whole about myself, but I think it's important to frame this just to be very clear that when I talk about my opposition to DIE, or so-called diversity, inclusion, and equity, some people's visual reaction, namely those that are politically puppeted by what I would consider a repulsive ideology, that has co-opted and usurped a lot of very important values in our society that generally are those for those that actually care and wish to help others. I do need to take a foot and put my foot down to be very clear that these terms have been usurped. So before I got into university teaching, something that some people don't know is, including my students maybe, they may not know that actually I spent a number of years working in inclusion. So actually I worked in children's education and childcare. I worked with children with special needs, for instance. That was one of the first opportunities I had to work, was actually as an inclusion specialist, where I worked with children, for example, with extreme forms of autism, schizophrenia, and other forms of things I would never want to wish on someone, to be frank. But ultimately, it's about raising and trying to help individuals and children especially overcome obstacles and those limitations so that they can be stronger people to overcome and pursue their dreams. So I've been interested actually in STEM since I was a very small child. I did not have a quote unquote role model in science, just to be very clear. I always had to carve my own pathway. So every way I had to do things, it was always, I had to be the first to do it within my family. And also, I did not like have a role model proper, really, until a little later on into my academic career. So I spent actually a lot of time focusing on getting people excited about science. And I think that's a key thing that a lot of people in universities forget is that ultimately, if you want to recruit people that are great and interested in science, you got to talk to children. Like you gotta talk to people about what gets you excited every day. So that's what I did actually for a number of years. I worked with childcare. I worked actually as a mad scientist for Mad Science about Manitoba, which I'm eternally thankful for the opportunities I had with Mad Science. We worked in all sorts of different schools together, in classrooms, from subsidized schools to all sorts of schools, from all sorts of cultural backgrounds, all sorts of just generally just a lot of interesting children and all sorts of different people. One of the things I'm always happy to look back on, and the wonderful coworkers I had, was actually working at the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada, where this is, to be clear, this is the old museum before they built the new one in Winnipeg. So I worked there as a museum interpreter and science educator. I worked with thousands of children as parts of the core curriculum for their science units, for things such as weather, flight, and so on. I was a part of the delivery of a lot of these programs. I've always been thankful for the opportunities I had there. It's one of the things I always look back on. So that being said, I spent a lot of time actually working in education before I even got into teaching at the university. So a lot of people's experience, especially scientists, their first experience with inclusion has been this die thing. To be very clear, that's not the same thing as the thing that I'm talking about when I talk about inclusion. Just be very clear. We're talking about two different things. So my experience is I'm coming in as somebody that is experienced with inclusion, that's going into post-secondary and watching this movement, the socio-political movement that has a religious components to it. I must be frank about that. I call them quasi-religious, to be quite a bit more precise with my language, and watched it happen, especially towards after 2012, 2014, specifically after 2014. I noticed that there was a lot more of this trend towards die. But I've worked at all sorts of institutions as an instructor, lecturer, professor. As I said, I'm actually a junior faculty level professor. I have a lot in stake for this discussion. I'm very concerned about the topic at hand, not the things I'm discussing here, but the concerns that I do have. I think many need to pay attention. I've spent a long time focused on academic standards and principles. I've joined departments just to try to help them fix their curriculum. So what is DIE? So it goes by many names: EDI, DEI, EDID. So D is for decolonization there. EDIBJ, that's belonging and justice. It's an umbrella of related activism and worldviews. So there's a lot of different phrases that are commonly used that often mean the opposite of what they mean. But I'm going to let you just decide upon yourself. But for brevity, we're going to talk about it just as DIE. So that's what I'm going to refer to this as. It goes by many different names, and it encompasses many different activist movements and certain types of political ideologies. So for relevance of this talk, based on what I've just told you a little bit about, it's a particular way to treat people. It's not just like any arbitrary way. When you hear the word diversity, people like to hear about that. But ultimately, those that practice or do what some people call praxis with a lot of these types of things, they actually do something very specific. It's actually a particular method, a procedure, a particular way of performing these actions. So these are often a collection of beliefs and goals, as I'm going to show you in a moment. It's ambiguous and often uses simplified language, but often it's utilized in the sake of these ambiguities. It's often used for other aims. And often, like I said, it commonly treats people as representatives of groups as opposed to individuals, which ultimately, I don't know how you can do that with students. Just to be very frank with you, I think that we should treat all students fairly as individuals. I don't know how you can even define the notion of excellence without an individual, at least if we're thinking about how courses are normally run at universities. Because I often hear this phrase, and I see this numerous times, how important diversity and equity are to excellence, which I don't know how that even applies in situations for which, like, you have a student. Say, for example, when I do my theoretical computer science research, I don't know where diversity and equity have anything to do with that. And they might say, oh, well, you're just not doing science right. Well, now you've crossed the line. Now you're talking about science. You're not talking about, you're encroaching on the intellectual autonomy of the academic. But so like I said, unlike science, this is not built on objective principles and is not universal. This is not to be confused, by the way, when we talk about inclusion and equity. This is not the same as recognizing that discrimination does happen to people. And I mean like real stuff, not none of this fake stuff, to be very clear. We're talking about very real forms of discrimination. I appall all of such things, and I think it's very important that people do take action when that happens, such as what I'm doing in this talk. So, DIE is not to be treated as the same as traditional inclusion practices, meant to include everybody as applicable. So, just to be very clear, I'm not a part of the DIE people. We have very different views on how to treat people. So let me give you an example. So this is from University of Manitoba. I wanted to read this to you just so you can get the idea that, yes, it uses very simplified or even ambiguous language to cause for reinterpretations of what these words mean. And often these prey on otherwise well-intentioned people. And I've seen this happen numerous times. So it says, we understand equity, diversity, and inclusion as three terms with many definitions. So they acknowledge that there's many definitions for these things. So just keep that put like behind your ear. So as a brief overview, equity has to do with fair rather than equal treatment. So this is not about equality, it's about equity. So if say you're a scientist, you're just looking at writing your grant or something like that, and you hear like equity, don't think it's equality. They're not the same thing. This quote, for instance, says such. Diversity can refer to all sorts of characteristics and identities and not a characteristic that can be measured or completed. I don't really know exactly what that means, but it's a little unclear what that means. You might have to depend on who you ask, because some people actually want to measure things such like that. The federal government, for example, is rather interested in things like that. The inclusion goes beyond just an invitation to join a group towards a feeling, a sense of mattering or belonging within a group. Now, again, like I said, this is rather ambiguous what this means. What does it mean to have a sense of mattering in the first place? Does that mean kowtowing to every single political view of a given person? Does it mean cutting all down, figuratively, the knees of everybody in the classroom so everybody's not getting as good of an education? What does it mean? I don't know. There's always a fine line with inclusion that a lot of people aren't prepared to discuss, is that there is a fine line that exists where ultimately you can't compromise certain lines of inclusion. So this is what I'm referring to. So you notice there's a lot of ambiguous language or in simplified terms. Here's actually what you should be paying attention to. So this is actually from the remaining part of the paragraph. It says equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives share common goals. So they share common goals with conversations around anti-oppression, decolonization, indigenization, reconciliation, anti-racism, accessibility, and social justice. Do note the lack of comma there. That means accessibility and social justice, among others. So it is not simply just you get to determine whatever diversity means. It doesn't mean that you get to determine those things. It shares common goals with all of these socio-political movements and some of these very, very specific ideological ones. So, and this is very common. You'll find that they use very light, tendered euphemisms for words, but they actually have other meanings that aren't really universal ones. They're very specific. They have very specific methods for which you want to think about things and how to think about them. So, two natural questions. How do you determine if your goals as an academic are in alignment with DIE? Like how do you determine it? Like, apparently these, according to the same passage, it talks about these movements are not identical. So what's in common among all of them? I'll leave that for you to decide. But what if you don't share these goals or abstain from them just out of matter of principle, like me? Like I abstain from these things because I don't see them as helpful in my classroom. In fact, I just think that they often are attacks on a lot of what I do as a scientist. Because frankly, to talk about people's identities like this and bring politics into science like this, and I'm not saying that politics has never existed in science, to be very clear. I'm saying that we need to uphold basic standards. And that means upholding principles. But what if you're a prospective faculty member, someone like me, that wants to get into the university like they've dreamt for their whole life, that has worked for many years trying to enable and encourage thousands upon, well, about thousands at least, children and young adults and just generally students from all sorts of backgrounds to pursue computer science. What do you do in this situation? And that's what we're going to discuss here. So when you talk about DIE in the context of STEM, first, DIE has nothing to do with science, to be very clear. They're very different things. This is actually coming from the outside, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, But ultimately, you have this sledgehammer, and someone's wielding the sledgehammer, namely those that are enabling or using the language of die to push forward political or ideological causes, or even somewhat quasi-religious causes. So if you're in the way of the sledgehammer, what do scientists naturally do? Well, scientists just want to do their science, right? Like they want to just do research, they want to be left alone. So they get out of the way of the sledgehammer. Well, what happens if somebody gets hit by this thing? Well, maybe they're gone. Like they're not going to, like, and keep in mind, this is a figurative sledgehammer. It's not a literal sledgehammer. It's not going to murder them. Just to be very clear. However, that could mean that this professor, maybe said the wrong position about die in a capacity that for which they had all entitlement to say those things, but ultimately were pushed out of their position, for example, or maybe they were fired even though they're tenure faculty. Perhaps they said the correct thing, but that's not the same thing as the winning phrase or the winning argument, because often with die, it's not about being correct, it's often about winning the argument. What do you do when you're dealing with a mechanism like a sledgehammer that's being whaled around recklessly in areas for which it really matters that people are able to scrutinize, criticize, and ultimately determine whether things have some bearing in reality? So what exactly happens? And that's what we're going to talk a lot about here today. So I'm going to be talking about a framework for determining exclusion. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some optimization in relation to theory of algorithms to help frame this discussion. You're going to find that this is really going to feel really natural. I'm going to draw a lot of pictures to help with this. So given a list of academic requirements of a candidate, I want you to naturally select the best best applicant or candidate for said position. So this is a one casting of the merit principle. So any qualified academic should know what the merit principle is. If you don't know what the merit principle is and you're, say, a tenured faculty member, I think you should leave. You're not qualified to be in your position. Just to be quite frank. There's a lot of people that I think don't understand what the merit principle is. They've forbidden, or even worse, they've abandoned these principles for other causes. So they have abandoned the principles of the position that the general public has entrusted to them at a public institution like a university. What I want to talk about here is that hiring committees decide on key academic objectives to seek in candidates. Ultimately, the candidates are a feasible solution. So for those that don't know, feasible solution, it means it's a candidate solution. So you get the best answers among the possible candidates you get to pick from. The committee decides on one of them or possibly two of them, and they have to give a justification usually for why they picked those candidates. Someone at least has to. So this is a common framework for this, and academic qualifications. Notice that everywhere here is a discussion about academic requirements and qualifications. So things that professors often are always involved in. Things like research contributions, publications, academic teaching, academic service. But often people misunderstand things to be qualifications that aren't academic ones. So for example, physical appearance or immutable characteristics, those are not academic qualifications. They have nothing to do with academics. The fact that people have started considering things like this are grotesque, to be quite frank with you, and often they forget the idea that science can be done by anyone. They don't have to have, they could be missing an arm, they could be missing a leg, they may be missing an eye, but they can ultimately do science, and we should be encouraging that mentality. We should have an inclusive process for considering candidates. So naturally, considering all applicants should not exclude. So you shouldn't be restricting the applicant pool. So the applicant pool, those are potential candidates that could apply for your position. So these are by academic qualifications. Now, to be very clear for our discussion, we're talking about people with PhDs. We're not talking about people that have been truly marginalized by society as a whole. We're not talking about, say, homeless people. We're not talking about people that have no high school education. We're talking about people that have went through at least 5 to 8 years of university. We're talking about people that are aware of what the ecosystem that they're presently in is, and they know usually how to apply for jobs. So let's talk a little bit about this. So I have all these dots. You have some of them choose to apply. So remember, I'm not saying that this picture is perfect. So I'm not claiming that there are no barriers, but I'm saying that the amount of barriers that exist for someone with a PhD to apply to an academic position, at least in an ideal world where we don't put restrictions on the applicants, which we're going to be discussing those today, they have the choice to apply. So ultimately, you can reduce it down to the applicant pool, and you decide, hey, look, one of them is the most qualified candidate. So you have your applications. They review these applications, preferably by, well, actually, mainly by their academic qualifications. That's what a qualified academic hiring committee should do. And they see all sorts of things, for instance, that are based on academic values, academic principles, academic standards, things that help their department or division with respect to academics. So ultimately, they decide to pick, say, the yellow dot. Well, the yellow dot ultimately had a choice to apply for the job or not, right? They had a choice. They could go in the circle, like the inner oval here, or the outer oval, right? But they had a choice to do this. But what happens if all potential applicants are not considered? So to be very clear, like I said, this is a simplification I am making, but it is a realistic scenario. Most people that have PhDs know how to apply for academic jobs. So let's talk about this in terms of like outcards is sort of like a mini inspection of this situation. So I'm going to define two terms. So these are my definitions for these. These are based on my observations and other terms that I've seen people use for these. So preferential hiring is when you have hiring where all qualified applicants can apply, but preference will be given to applicants if they belong to what is called a preferred group. This is specified by a non-academic qualification. Do notice that it's a non-academic qualification. Not confused with something like, do they have a PhD? Like that is not an example of preferential hiring in this definition. Restricted hiring is actually a special version of preferential hiring where you take that outer oval, the potential applicants, and you say, hey, look, only your choice of applying, you don't get a choice anymore, except unless you belong to the preferred group. That is what restricted hiring is. So it's a restriction on the applicant pool. So it restricts, namely, the applicants that can apply. So I must note that there is some disagreement on what preferential hiring may mean. In my research, I made it as explicit, not implied. So I'll explain why this matters a little later. But anyways, let's talk about some examples. So just as a quick couple of cases. So here's University of Regina from this year. They talked about targeting candidates who self-declare as women. Just as a little remark here, I must stress that technically speaking, regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on, I don't sit on really any. To be very clear here. Not everyone that is a woman self-declares as a woman. They just are a woman. Or for instance, they've tried their whole life to be recognized as a woman. Maybe they don't want to self-declare as a woman. Maybe we just should treat them like a woman. Just saying. So notice that these are actually not the same categories. They're not the same. University of Victoria. This is actually a repeat offender of restricted hiring in my research. They were actually restricting on a number of groups, and they're doing this under a accordance of the BC Human Rights Code. So they're limiting applicants based on the following categories below. So as a similar kind of phrasing here is used, they have to self-identify with one of the designated groups. So they may not actually be one of the groups. Do note the phrasing, things like capital B for Black, capital I for Indigenous, but notice no uppercase for disability or disabled persons. That's rather interesting. Maybe it shows a tinting of the language here, mainly by some ideologue. Just so we need to be very careful when I talk about this with you. So do notice that I talk about self-identifying with the group as opposed to being a part of the group. So you might ask, Dan, why does that matter? I'll give you an example why in a moment. So here's an example of preferential hiring. This one actually made the rounds, actually in some news outlets that actually did talk a little bit about this. I was one of the first people that documented this. I sent this along to SAFs at the time, and others had noticed and picked it up some months a little bit later than this. It's also worth noting that McGill also put out an ad just like this one the year after about fighting inequities. Now, I must be stressed that computer science isn't about social inequities. You can use it to study things, maybe, but most certainly, critical race theory has nothing to do with the foundations of computer science. Just to be quite clear, it's an outside or applied concept. It's not actually computer science. So do note, I want to notice a couple things here. First, this background here, they actually have a desirable category for critical race theory, which again, that's not a computer science topic. I have no issue with interdisciplinary responsibility or issue pursuing things, but this very much sounds like an activist advertisement. But here's the thing that makes it preferential hiring. It's actually right at the bottom. You'll see that it says preference will be given to candidates who self-identify as capital B Black. That's what makes it a preferential hiring advertisement. It's not actually these other components. It's actually that specifically. So that being said, what are not examples? So for example, notice that all of these are on non-academic qualifications or qualities. So for example, if a hiring committee were to restrict on a scientific or academic area that's core to their field to enhance or complement parts of their department, that isn't an example of preferential hiring in our definition. So for example, the Department of Computer Science seeks applicants for the area of computer architecture or computer systems to enhance our department. All applicants are welcome, but preference will be given those interested in these areas or those related. So this isn't actually an example of preferential hiring in our definition because it's based strictly on academics, not non-academic qualifications. So let me show you what this looks in our framework. My apologies. So now, remember we had our applicant pool. We have now the green oval there. Those are your applicants. But I want you to first consider preferential hiring, and then we're going to consider restricted hiring. So the bluish oval, that is your preferred group. So that is the preferred group in our definition of a preferential hire. So do notice that not everyone that is in the preferred group actually applies. There could be various reasons for that. For instance, they may choose not to apply because they don't want to be stereotyped. Perhaps they disagree with the notion of self-identifying as something that is a part of them. Like what they are, as opposed to who they are. They might see it as a concern because they might be singled out because of the way they were born. Either way, these are various absolutely reasonable cases for why someone in the preferred group would not apply. Because these are ultimately, these all are different ways of looking at someone and saying, yeah, all that work you did as an academic, it doesn't matter. It just matters that you're, for example, self-declaring as a woman or self-declaring as capital B Black. That's what matters. It doesn't matter that you spent years developing, say, fascinating neat applications for cancer treatment based on new computing technologies. Or studying certain parts of things using machine learning. Perhaps maybe developed a new algorithm. Nah, none of that matters. You're part of the preferred group. But if you're applying, you get preference over those that aren't a part of the blue oval. So some people might opt out because they don't want to be stereotyped. And I'm not saying that the people reviewing these applications are just going to immediately presume that that's the most qualified candidate. It's the fact that you're ultimately reducing a person from being the academic that person is to being a part of a group, like that collectivism mindset, as opposed to looking at the qualifications of the applicant, which is actually a violation. If you think of it, it might violate the merit principle. So look at our picture here. So notice that there is this overlap. So you have the preferred applicants. So I have a blue dot, a red dot, and a yellow dot. So suppose that you asked yourself, okay, well, we have the blue dot, the red dot, and the yellow dot. Now, suppose that the yellow dot actually was the most qualified person for this job, but you ultimately restricted the pool of the people that you would give preference to the blue dot, and those that are in there, the other white dots there. So if you do that, you've ultimately excluded the yellow dot. But remember, the yellow dot actually had a choice in this case. They could have been like the red dot. But here's the thing. The red dot might get considered if, say they had information to know that that person may have been more qualified. So in this case, if we want to ask, can you certify the blue dot is the best candidate? if you were to just only examine the intersection, so if we're looking at this, I'm not talking about buzzwords, I'm talking about like set theory here. We're looking at the intersection of the blue oval and the green oval. They review the applicants, say, in that pool, and they give them preference, and they select the blue dot. They ultimately have to justify why they didn't pick the red dot if they're not going to be exclusive. So I want to propose one idea for how you might go about trying to do something like this. So very often in computer software, or even just in algorithms more generally, you have this notion of input and output. So, and you have some process or a computer program or an algorithm that takes an input, produces output. In our case, you have your applicants, and as output, you have a selection of candidate. Now, that's a very basic way of looking at this, but how do you determine if exclusion happened? Say, for instance, of that red dot, if the blue dot got picked. Or how do you know that the blue dot is the most qualified candidate as per the merit principle? Well, here's the thing. If you had, for instance, a certifier or checker, that where what you do is you make the hiring committee have to provide a certificate or proof that they have actually selected the most qualified candidate, and it actually shows that the blue dot is more qualified than the red dot, then you can give this to ultimately a checker that is separate from that hiring committee, that has no bones to pick with die or anything like that. They just look at the applicants, your certificate or proof, and the answer that you gave. And they either have to tell you that, yeah, I'm convinced that you didn't exclude anyone, or you reject it and say, no, you excluded somebody that was more qualified. You're violating the merit principle. So this is actually a notion in theoretical computer science, namely in the theory of algorithms, called the certification algorithm. I'm going to include a link in an upcoming set of slides here to this if you're curious about it. But so in preferential hiring, you could use that to discern from the blue dot and the red dot. However, it tells you nothing about the yellow dot, which is unfortunate, because in restricted hiring, if we use the same idea of having a certification algorithm where you have a certificate that gets presented, the yellow dot ultimately is excluded. It can't be considered because it's not an applicant. Unless you started asking each one of these dots and asking, were you excluded by our hiring process? Which you know that many universities would not choose to participate in, because that's poor optics for a lot of universities these days. Many universities these days operate on optics, not on academics, which we need to take that into serious consideration and discuss this. So in restricted hiring, the blue oval and the green oval are actually the exact same oval. And notice that the blue dot and the red dot, they may as well just be the same dots. So notice that now our certifier, namely our certification algorithm and the certificate, this process, it'll fail to detect the yellow dot because it's not an applicant. Yellow dot is not an applicant. Ultimately, to certify in this case would not be sufficient to determine exclusion. You would need ultimately people to come forward and tell you that they're being excluded. This is actually why I'm giving this talk. So for my research, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, because when I started thinking about all the years I spent in inclusion, and I started seeing that there was this new form of language being used in discussions around DIE in relation to academic hiring and all these other decisions, I seen that they just didn't really function at all like I'm used to as someone that has spent years working in inclusion and trying to promote science to all sorts of people. So I started looking at job advertisements on the website CSCAN, which this is a website that is very often used for communication across multiple departments across Canada and for computer science. And they actually post jobs on their website. So I started monitoring it, and along with other universities, and I tried to document job advertisements that would violate the merit principle. So it started off with preferential and restricted hiring because that's what came first. But remember, we're not really caring as much about trends here, though you're going to see in my results that there most certainly are concerning trends. But I do not wish to infer things from these trends. I just want to leave it up to you to decide whether they're valuable to you or not. But remember, any one incident of preferential or restricted hiring may violate the merit principle, violating basic academic standards. Just remember that. So I want to show you how I did this. So here's a screenshot of CSCAN from the 12th. Well, what I do is I go through the list. I see, oh, well, look, there's some new ads here. So maybe I'll click on the one for University of Manitoba that was posted, say, 3 weeks ago. Well, I click on it. Okay, it's assistant associate professor. That's what the title of it says. I didn't say it wrong. That's how the title is. It says that the Department of Computer Science at the University of Manitoba is seeking 2 professors who identify as women. So do notice that this is actually, they give a very similar reason to the University of Regina ad as well in their advertisement. But notice that this is restricted hiring. So look at that. We discovered restricted hiring at University of Manitoba. So, and I must stress, it's very important to recognize these facts because at universities across Canada, there's actually a homogeneity among the cultures of many universities across Canada. And that's actually what a lot of my research shows, is that this isn't just simply like 3 universities doing this. It's happening at a lot of schools that students are interested in pursuing. And I'm very concerned about this, ranging from the scientific research or scientific output of these institutions, the integrity of them. And I'm doing this as an academic that is trying to help prevent the self-destruction of these institutions from the inside. We need to get and instill principles once again. So that being said, you want to document it? I suggest you use print to PDF. So you have a timestamp. I must stress that some websites don't store the timestamp depending on how they program the website. It may not show the timestamp. So I suggest somewhere recording it, whether it be in the name of the file or something like that. I put a tip line here, so you can check out this tip line if you're curious about reporting any that aren't in my data set. By the nature of my data set, it is limited, but it is archived. Publicly, most of it is through the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, SAFS. They've done a wonderful job. I've actually worked a lot with the former president of SAFS and to archive many of these cases. And you can find them at the link that I provided there. But I'll also be working on other ways we can archive these. But I've looked at job ads from CSCAN and other university websites. Now, one thing, I haven't defined what a die pledge is, but it's important I bring this up because it's a part of the setup. So I recorded whenever I observed that on CSCAN, whether it was a die pledge, which I'm going to define these in a little bit, or not. And I indicated whenever I couldn't find a secondary source for it with a question mark afterwards. So what I did is I went through my advertisements after in 2023 just to see if they are in fact something I could corroborate with a secondary source. I suggest if you plan to use my data sets, do not use rows to infer things on the question mark rows. Remember, the row exists and it has evidence for it, but its presence on CSCAN with a question mark, I would suggest not using it to make inferences, just because it lacks a secondary source. So here's an example of what it might look like for one of our data sets here. I have different columns here for like the university, the month, the year, whether it's a die pledge that was associated with it, if it's preferential or restricted, the level it is at, the date it was accessed, comments or descriptions of the positions, a source, including, I must stress that some of these ads don't necessarily have the original job ad at them anymore. That's why I'm saying I'm introducing more additional ways to archive these things. But the note of having a permalink dictates that there was a job ad there before. And of course, the number of positions. So I've done something very similar to this with die pledges. Again, I'll define those later. But this is an example of what the data set as of yesterday, what it looks like. So December 12th, 2023. So here's some limitations. Remember, it's reported incidents, so the data is not complete. It's not necessarily complete. I observed them from 2019 to 2023. Not all university websites. Sometimes universities actually place their job ads behind a login system. More on that a little later. In addition, ads that were not found on CSCAN, I marked them with N on the die pledge columns for if it's present on CSCAN or not. I must stress that the preferential restricted hiring ads did not keep track of the CSCAN, but you'll find that many of these ads, because of the probability that it is going to have also a die pledge, will also be present in that other data set. So earlier years, some of the ads were posted, but like I said, they often lacked a secondary source. So those I wanted to be honest about, and whenever I was not sure if I could secondarily support it, I put a question mark there. A challenge with developing and collecting this data is very often new incidents may have hidden or implicit requirements. I'm going to show you an example of this in a little bit. So here is the results I got for restricted or preferential hiring. So do notice that each year there have been increasing numbers. You might ask, what about 2022 there? This is actually where the disagreements on what preferential hiring is. I took them to be explicit, but many ads around that year were rather implicit. For instance, you'll find that if you go into the cases on the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship website, you'll find that for many of the ads I've labeled as like I didn't consider some of them the preferential hiring because they weren't explicit enough. However, you could debate that they were, and if you do include those, it'll actually match up closer to 2021 or be slightly higher than that. But do notice that it seems to be a trend, but either way, any one occurrence of this is a concern because it may violate the merit principle, which is violating a core academic principle. So just a couple things I wanted to mention is of these, the percent of these that were restricted hiring was at least 64%, and those that required die pledges was more than 50%. It was around 60%. So again, I'll define that in a moment. But the main takeaway I want to talk about is that if ever you're, say, on a hiring committee and you're like, okay, how can I determine if there's exclusion happening? Maybe I can adopt some of the ideas of certification algorithms or policies. I suggest that you consider this as a tool that you might use. And remember, the whole idea is that we want to be as neutral as possible, not impose a political ideology or a quasi-religion on the hiring process. We want it to be about academics and only about academics as much as we can. We're human, we try our best. But better inclusive practices, so these are suggestions as someone that practices inclusively, all sorts of different things, and I've worked very hard and passionately towards that. I suggest that you better inform the public what your field is. Fields like computer science are notorious for not being really well understood by the general public or even other scientists. So I suggest that you spend time, maybe take like a day or two, go visit one of the elementary schools, talk to some of the children there, tell them a little bit about something that's exciting about computer science. These are little things you can do to help plant a seed so that they have a better understanding of what computer science is about. There's so many times where I run into students where they walk in, and I'm always that guy that teaches like data structures and algorithms, so I always have to break them in and realize that you didn't really sign up for a program or all you're doing is computer programming. You're actually in a science field, right? So there's more to it than just that. Fundamentally, include everyone that is qualified. Treat them as individuals with individual backgrounds. Do the same that I would do when I was working as an inclusion specialist. Do not discriminate on the grounds of immutable characteristics or group identity when recruiting faculty. Very simple. And of course, as we've seen in our example there with the yellow dot, do not exclude or discriminate against the yellow dot. That is something you should highly consider because that is now what we're going to talk about here. Let's talk about die pledges. So here's my definition of a die pledge, and you'll find that this should be a rather reasonable one. It encompasses and can be applied in many different settings. The requirement or expectation of an applicant to give or present a commitment to die, taking at least one of the following three forms. 1, a job requirement is to be committed to die. 2, requiring a statement about die, often called a diversity statement or an EDI statement. Or 3, the position itself as a die activist to some extent, including promotion or advocacy supporting die. Note, I must be stressed, this is not to be confused when institutions like to talk a lot about themselves in their job advertisements. You find this very often. I've looked at a lot of job advertisements by doing this over the years. A lot of them like to talk a lot about die in their advertisements, but they don't actually require or expect it of the applicant. But now we're seeing a shift where exactly that is actually happening. And that's in the form of the die pledge. So I want to give you some examples. So I must stress, I'm not trying to target or single out a given university. These are meant to provide examples from various levels of academic hiring. So that way you can see that this isn't just simply happening to one type of academic. This is happening at entry level. This is happening at high-ranked universities. This is happening to contract positions and so on. So for example, here's one from University of Toronto from this year. Candidates are also expected to show evidence of a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's an example of Form 1. Let's look at Vancouver Island University from this year. This is a limited term contract instructor. So this is one that actually isn't a permanent position. This is actually just a contract, a limited term. It says a commitment to and an understanding of the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the classroom. And the third one here I have from Dalhousie for the Truro campus. This was for a position where they were going to be the only instructor at that campus, from my understanding. You can take a look at the ad and see for yourself. It says the candidate must demonstrate a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion and accessibility. So see, these are all forms of the first kind. Here's examples from the second form. So these ones require the statement. So this is actually one from Western. I've actually written an open letter to the department chair of computer science there about this. I think this one's especially concerning. So I'll explain in a moment. So it says application must include the approach they would take to meeting principles of now the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion in this position. So this must be stressed. This is what they call a Duncanson Chair in Ethics and Technology. So this is a cross-appointed position for computer science and philosophy. So this is first off, this is an ethics position, and I've been watching this advertisement very closely because they've been advertising it to really be about trying to discuss modern issues with artificial intelligence and all sorts of other things of that sort. I couldn't tell you how hypocritical it is to ask an applicant to do this, because ultimately you're asking an ethics position, like a professor that's going to be studying ethics, to also violate another set of ethics to apply for this position, namely those of an academic. So keep in mind, we'll talk more about that a little later. So they might violate them. It may be that they're very up on board of these ideological positions. I don't know, but that's the concern. Here's a second one. An equity, diversity, and inclusion statement. Often they can be very simple like this, but regardless, it is asking for a statement about how the applicant is going to pursue or study or exercise it. I must stress that many of these ads, you always have to look at the rest of the context of the letters in the advertisement. So the parts of the, sorry, I should be a bit more precise. If you look at the advertisements, you often will see that parts of them actually frame the context of the statement, and you can actually make a very definitive statement whether they have a certain outcome they're looking for the statement. Here's the third one. This one's close to heart for me because this is for theoretical computer science at University of Alberta. In fact, this ad actually, I would be someone that could apply for this one. In fact, the areas within the ad, I actually study a lot of the positions in this ad. So, but I couldn't apply for it because guess what? It requires a 1 to 2 page equity, diversity, and inclusion statement, which includes the candidate's contributions and plans to advance EDI in their research, teaching, mentoring, and service. So even though EDI has nothing to do with theoretical computer science, there is no underlying pinning of Turing machines in relation to EDI. There is no mathematical nature of computation in relation to EDI. You can most certainly probably use it to study things like EDI, but most certainly it's not the foundations of it. They're asking for this from a theoretical computer scientist. I wanted to show you one example, and this is not the only example, but I wanted to show it to you in its full so you can really get a flavor for what these might look like. So this is from University of New Brunswick. So I'm going to read this in full to you. So this is of the third form. This EDI assistant teaching position, professor, will promote gender balance and equity, increase participation and recognition of Indigenous and underrepresented groups, and support for greater accessibility of computer science programs. That can mean a lot of different things, just to be very clear. Ideally, they may be a role model and champion of programs coordinating with other groups and leaders on campus to offer a range of programs such as scholarship, targeted learning opportunities, cultural events, and community-focused outreach to increase EDI in the Faculty of Computer Science and to foster recognition of these goals in academic programming, experiential learning programs, and entrepreneurship. So do notice that this ad actually is all about propagating EDI. It's an activist position. So anyways, as a note, and this is actually has to do with those challenges I was talking about a little earlier with research, die pledges don't actually have to be explicit within the ad. They can actually be a part of the process of the ad. So for example, with University of Waterloo, this is something I've been observing since 2022, is that University of Waterloo will actually hide their die pledges actually behind their login system. So the ad itself won't say that you're required to give such a statement, but they'll actually require it. So be very careful for this. I'm worried that more schools are catching on to this and trying to use this more often, where the ad is not telling you the instructions completely, often to hide details about the process. And when naturally the process should be as transparent as possible. So I wanted to kind of take a big step back. People are like, oh, well, Dan, you've been like harping on die a little bit. But ultimately, die represents a family of ideas, devoutly believed or practiced, and present a particular way of treating human beings. But is there a consistent bug that exists with requiring die pledges? Well, let's take our same definition. We'll call it a P pledge. So everywhere I had die, I'm going to put P. I want to demonstrate to you that just the fact that it's die, that is one issue in its own right. Sorry, this has been a very difficult talk for me to have to give. But you could easily substitute this for any other kind of commitment that has an ideological bent to it, or a political bent to it, or a religious bent to it. So let me show you an example to make it more obvious for you. Here is a Christianity pledge. So everywhere, let me read this to you. So the requirement or expectation of an applicant to give or present a commitment to Christianity, taking at least one of the following three forms. Job requirement is to be committed to Christianity, requiring a statement about Christianity, or it could be that the position itself as a Christian activist to some extent. Maybe you're a missionary, including promotion or advocacy supporting Christianity. This seems to be a part of like, if you've seen this, you're like, okay, well, that seems a little strange that like for a public university to have that. You'd think that, especially for science, why would they want to know that? What you're like? Why would you want to know about their beliefs outside of like the lab or outside of the classroom like that? Like that has not a whole lot to do with specifically their academic work. At least in most contexts. There might be some extreme case that I am overlooking. I apologize to those that I am. But most certainly, this is a type of test, right? No one in their right mind would look at this at a public university where normally people think secular and think, oh yeah, no. Requiring them to just throw this, it's just a simple academic exercise. And that's often how people apologize for these things. They say it's just some exercise. It's extra paperwork. No, it's actually far more entrenched than just this, because it's not just simply whatever you want these words to mean. It's actually a very specific set of beliefs, practices, and so on. So just to hammer in the point even further, I just picked one political party. Here's the Liberal Party pledge. The commitment or expectation of an applicant to give or present a commitment to the Liberal Party, taking at least one of the following three forms. A job requirement is to be committed to the Liberal Party. Job requiring a statement about the Liberal Party. 3. The position is itself as a Liberal Party activist to some extent, requiring a promotion or advocacy supporting the Liberal Party of Canada. Again, like I said, I could have done this for any other political group or political party. But there's a bug with all of these, including the die pledge. They're not any different. They all limit some form of intellectual autonomy of the applicant and ultimately exposes them on non-academic grounds. These are, what about core academic principles and integrity being compromised? So here's my argument. Imposing die pledges is exclusionary and culls academics. The practice is corrupt, and it may lead to dangerous outcomes for science and technology and general trust among the public and science itself. Now you might ask, Dan, why would that be the case? Let's talk about it. So die pledges is the ideological litmus test. So I've already kind of convinced you, at least I hope, that this is not very much different. Die, as it operates in STEM institutions, is a top-down influence. It didn't organically exist there. It's something that is alien, that has come in as a parasite of sorts, that has come to effectively change how science is done in many departments. Now, again, like I said, people are welcome to agree or disagree about die. That's okay. But but should it be affecting things like the very procedures of science, hiring, scholarship, and so on? Even how people cite other people? That seems really reckless. That seems like a big, big problem because science is all about critical inquiry. Like, I mean, critical thinking, like inquiry, criticism, refinement of ideas, sharpening the blunt rock. Uh, so this is actually, as I'm going to document for you and present to you, these are, sorry, as I documented, this is actually a very recent phenomenon in STEM in Canada. It's been happening a little longer in the States, but in Canada, it's a much more recent phenomenon. So here are some concerns, because just like I discussed at the beginning of my talk, it creates ambiguous incentives for the candidates, because a lot of people in STEM, they just want to do their science. So what happens is like, what do you do when the sledgehammer comes for you? Do you wield the sledgehammer? Do you get out of the way of the sledgehammer? Do you get hit by the sledgehammer out of principle because you disagree with somebody wielding the sledgehammer? Do you grab the sledgehammer? It's very unclear which choice that different people will make. And ultimately, we have to think about principles and standards for academics. This is not about politics winning here or there. This is about standards. So here are some concerns. So for instance, one that has been an issue in science for a number of years, but I'm concerned that it's going to become a much larger concern, is the researcher as a used car salesman. So ultimately, some applicants will behave like used car salesmen, for which they will tell whatever the community wants to hear, but they never actually ever practice it themselves. They just want to tell you what you want to hear. So this is often very much what a lot of applicants for grants, for instance, will do, is they'll say whatever they need to. They're going to be complicit, but ultimately they step over the line from just being complicit to being openly a part of the process. And one more extreme version of this is, say, activism over excellence. So what about if somebody starts valuing like they stop caring about excellence and they start focusing on all of these die issues and they start encroaching that on everything else. So they become more of a cheerleader than an academic. This is one concern, complicity. So now I talked about the used car salesman. Well, there's a lot of academics, they take the path of least resistance. They just want to do their science. They don't want to be bothering anybody. So why should I do anything to buck the trend? So if I don't do it, why might do it? Or if I go against it, oh no. But ultimately, it is a careerist concern. So this is ultimately about academics versus careerists, or a conflict of interest or incentives that exists, namely in advancing. So if I write a statement how I align with die, I might get that promotion. I might get that grant. I might get the job. These are all valid concerns to people to have about when a pledge gets introduced. And I must stress, remember, this is a new mechanism being thrown in. So I thought it would be a good idea. I'd talk about some things that are out there just to illustrate the point of what exactly is going on. And I thought 2 points I would like to bring up are one from Professor Mark Mercer, the former president of SAFS. He wrote this beautiful essay, and beautiful in like in style, not necessarily like the topic itself is a very concerning one. Called "Swear Allegiance to Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or Don't Get Hired." I want to highlight some points from his essay. You can read the whole thing. He also offers the counterpoints for each one of them. Mark Mercer is a philosopher. So here's some main things that Mercer touches upon. Universities impose die pledges, and ultimately they may seek to discriminate against academics who don't follow EDI values or goals. That's one concern, naturally, of die pledges. EDI is fundamentally anti-academic, for it turns university away from intellectual communities and dispassionate investigation towards values and goals that are of contemporary social justice movements, which, as I discussed a little earlier, that seems to be quite much the case. And ultimately, asking for a commitment to die then is to ask a professor to behave contrary to the standards of academic life. So I talked about academic principles or academic standards. Mercer is resonating the same point here. So the biggest concerns other than this are that the university loses its character as an academic institution, in proportion to the degree it serves EDI in its structures, practices, incentives, and curricula, because it's anti-academic, according to Mercer. Again, provides very good arguments for this. And namely, the concern that Mercer has put out, and there's actually two parts to it at least. He has put several objections forward, but I wanted to highlight one that's going to bring me into the next point. EDI is anti-academic, and the practice of asking job applicants for EDI statements will increase the proportion of EDI supporters in universities. Thus, asking job applicants for EDI statements will lower the commitment of universities to academic values and their academic mission. Mercer has actually argued the idea that one concern that is a serious one is this idea that ultimately our universities are no longer academic universities. And the point is that I'm not opposed to the idea of being multiple kinds of universities. The issue is just that we live in a country in Canada where there are many universities and they're rather homogeneous in their cultures and what they do, because they often are quite coordinated in their communications. Well, what happens when one decides just, academics? Nah. We're the skin suit of the academic institution, and we don't really serve academic principles anymore. Mercer calls these post-academic institutions, and I'm often I'm quite convinced that that is actually an accurate label for a lot of the institutions going forward. I'm quite concerned about this, or the fact that they're becoming this. So again, one other point that Mercer brings up is, what do academics do if they don't go along with the herd in this case? And I thought that Mercer made an excellent point. This is actually the one that I'm going to highlight in the remainder of my talk, is one that actually Professor Alexander Barvanok very recently, in a letter to the editor of for the AMS, the American Mathematical Society, actually made, and I'm going to read this in whole because it actually executes the key thesis of what I'm going to be discussing for the remainder of this talk. And I must stress that Barvanok is not someone that I would consider like a quack or anything. Like, he's like at a whole other level. Like, he does a lot of fascinating algorithms and complexity research. With grave concern, I see the growing use of DDI statements as a required component for job applications, in particular in the mathematical sciences. So he sees a growing use of these things, which is what you're going to see in my talk. In my opinion, it has an enormous corrosive effect on the mathematics community and the education in this country. Even if one is required to say, I passionately believe that water would certainly wet us, as fire would certainly burn, the routine affirmation of one's beliefs as a precondition of making a living constitutes compelled speech and corrupts everyone who participates in the performance. Now, I think that Barvanok used the word performance in a very specific way, and I must stress that it's really nice because, like, not the top that we're talking about here. It's just that it's very coincidental because I was thinking about the same thing around the same time that he said this, and I think he hit it on the nail here. Is that, and this is the mechanism I'm going to present to you, and this is how academic culling is going to occur with die pledges. So unprecedented changes are happening, as my research is going to show, that this is actually a new phenomenon. It is a new mechanism in hiring decisions. Here's the concern. You have three possibilities that can happen, and I'm using the notion of mechanism design to cast it forward for you. So here's how academic or intellectual culling will occur, or at least can occur. So one possibility is not to affirm a genuine statement. Now, if you do this, ultimately you're being dishonest. You violate academic standards, and you have a general apathy towards academic standards, because as academics, we should be pursuing and being genuine and dispassionate in our inquiry, or how we express or discuss ideas. We should be able to do that because we're supposed to respect the intellectual autonomy of academics. The other possibility is that you maybe write a die pledge or a die statement, and you affirm it. Well, there's now concerns of academic plurality because you're okay with this procedure. You probably think that it's okay for other people to have to do it because you're doing it. It's this whole process of just going down into the deep pit. But ultimately, this is another concern, right? The third is, of course, to be opt out or reject. And this is to be excluded. And as you know, if you get excluded, you're the yellow dot. That's what the yellow dot is in the framework we talked about. That's number 3. So replace, now what's going to happen is because these are competitive positions, 1 and 2 are going to apply instead of 3. So if you repeat this, because naturally I'm thinking about this in a very algorithmic way, if you repeat this many, many times, what happens? Are we going to be encouraging intellectual autonomy of our academics, or are they going to just see this all as one big performance? Specifically, what if almost all key public Canadian universities introduce this new mechanism? Can we trust our institutions to function? Now, I say this in both a loose sense and a really concerning one. Imagine if you had scientists that were working on something and there was no one else to criticize the work they're doing. There is no counterbalance. There is no formalism for an applied area. There is no theory that is applied to some practice. There is no complementary piece to the study of a topic. Perhaps everyone just agrees about everything, instead of having it where people are dispassionately inquiring about things in the world or through expressing their ideas. Well, what happens? People get confident, they get cozy, they get sloppy. And we have all sorts of examples in history where politicization, ideology corrupts science. Think of like Lysenkoism, for example. That's an example. Imagine if there was no counterbalance, no scientific study of these things, and somebody gets killed by some random application of this because there wasn't a scientist to properly investigate this to better understand whether it was a good technique to use in practice or not. Or even just its fundamental nature. This should not be taken lightly. So let's use the framework now. So as I said, the yellow dot, that's number 3. The green oval, that's 1 or 2. And notice that if you were to even use my framework that I gave you earlier using a certification algorithm, you would not be able to determine the yellow dot because you have no process to determine the yellow dot even exists. So if you repeat this process again and again, you're ultimately going to be culling the yellow dots and any of the white dots that maybe disagree with what you're doing with the hiring process, or maybe the views that you're trying to inject into the academic responsibilities by violating the academic standards and principles of those individuals. So notice it's restricted hiring again, which we know is exclusionary. There it is. So anyways, you might ask, Dan, why are these mechanisms in place in the first place? Well, often they're actually counterbalanced by what we call dual mechanisms. So you have it where not just the mechanisms exist, they're actually self-reinforced by dual mechanisms. So for example here, like here's this scientist that's at McGill, I believe, that he was studying and performing all this research. He's been given several awards over his academic career, but because of new requirements on supposed DIE pledges for his grant applications, he was denied them. So that includes for NSERC and NFRF for similar reasons. These are one of the reasons that he was given for why he was not given his grants. And naturally, Pat here says something that I think is a very strong point and very similar to one I gave near at the beginning of the talk. As a scientist, our job is to think about how nature works, ask questions, and find answers without prejudice. We cannot do that anymore, which I completely agree. I think that is what is happening right now. So here are some dual mechanisms for you. So as I discussed, government funding programs, so NSERC, Canada Research Chairs, these actually all are embedded with DIE mechanisms right now. For example, Canada Research Chairs has equity targets. So if somebody tells you that this is all about just like making everybody feel welcome, that is absolutely not what's going on with Canada Research Chairs, for instance. They have equity targets for which applicants, they have to have certain immutable characteristics or they must self-identify as a given group. They may have to, they may not. You may agree or disagree with that, but regardless, you cannot deny that it's there. Now, I've already talked about the path of least resistance. One issue at hand, and I see that this is probably going to be the case for many academics that have currently been going along with this. They just want to do their science, but they've been sitting around not maintaining standards. Well, now we're running into the situation of sunk costs. So why stop now? Why maintain principles? Why There is no incentives to maintain principles. If you're the one that gets called, like, there's a concern that if you're the one that is in the position where you have to realize that, oh yeah, I made a lot of these mistakes, I excluded all these academics, am I the baddie here? Like, I don't like talk about good and bad, but I'm just trying to be kind of playful with this. Like, are you the person that violated basic academic standards? Are you willing to be responsible for that? I think that many academics aren't. I think many are cowards. They won't be willing to discuss this openly unless somebody drags them out and asks them to do so. And that is one concern I do have. And in fact, I've seen this a lot with the open letters I've been writing to departments this year that have been imposing die pledges, is that there's poor leadership. If you look at many universities, you'll find that they often talk all about how, like, they put like die like on a pedestal that's above everything else, and that's not how to run an academic university. That is how you run a post-academic institution. That's as far as I'm concerned. Another major concern is diversity managerialism. Now, I've personally encountered this before, but this is actually the ultimate thing, and this is what I'm very concerned about, is that universities are adopting DIE as a brand. So this is actually a direct threat to academic freedom. I've encountered it personally myself. I've seen other academics that have also been confronted with this, where at some universities, what they do is they basically say DIE is a brand. So all this activism, all this ideology and all this is a part of their brand. So if you attempt to criticize it, say for instance, and you have all right to do that, by the way. Academics, often in their collective agreements, even if you don't agree with general principles, in a collective agreement, almost always do they have clauses specifically there meant for criticism of your university. So what happens is you create ambiguities by creating DIE as a brand, because now you can't criticize the administration's brand, right? So very often you get phrases like this, and this is something that's happened to me. This has happened to other good academics that are just doing their job. As an academic staff member, it's important to understand how your conduct reflects on the university as a whole. This is silly. Like, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because many times this is because the academic actually is just doing their job and they're criticizing. You're instead of having it where you can have an open dialogue about the concern or the criticism, instead what you do is your branding actually trumps, chills, or forbids dispassionate and conscientious inquiry, which is a threat to academic freedom. If you want actually an example of how diversity managerialism has affected academics, you can actually look at my case from University of Regina in 2021. I'll include a link for that video if you're wondering what happened. But there's other cases like this where, and you don't hear about many of them because those academics, they're scared to talk about it because they're scared they're going to lose their whole livelihood. Or even worse, they've already been booted out of the schools, and you never hear about them because they're scared they're going to never get a job ever again. And that's wrong. Like, I don't know how you could function at a university. Like, how can a university function where the academics are too scared to criticize violations of their own occupation's principles? Could you imagine a daycare center, for example, where half the staff were abusing the small children, and what happened was the other half of the employees, they don't say anything. They're scared they're going to lose their job. Well, here, this is what's happening. It's very much comparable, at least at a figurative level. It's a violation of the principles of a university and the academics. And presently, the universities are now rebranding themselves using strategies like diversity managerialism, where very often you're not allowed to criticize DIE. And that is something of deep concern because now, this means that many academics that just want to do their science, they just want to do science, they want to do their job. Like me, I just want to do my job. I want to pursue exploring foundations of science, but I also am an academic too, and I need to be able to criticize ideas as they exist. And to have a university that functions requires naturally a process of feedback, whether it be public or private. Ultimately, there has to be discussion that happens so that a university can refine and become a better place with better standards so that everyone can benefit from a university. So as I said, the dual mechanism, of course, in this case, is the idea of the post-academic institution. So here are my results. So here we go. So again, I talked about this earlier on. So these are the number of CS job ads I found. So these are across CSCAN and other university websites. You'll see that the prominence of this has dramatically increased, more by doubling each time. I see this as a very concerning trend, and I must stress that it doesn't mean that the next year is going to double. It means that there's many people that might be filling in new roles, for instance. That's how it is at some schools. But this also means that now all of these new applicants, they're going through the same mechanism. So those that apply for these positions, they're going to be of 1 or 2. They're not going to be of 3. Remember, they've been called. They're not a part of this. They've been excluded. So if I look at only the CS-CAN ones, so this is just apples to apples, you see the same issue where the prominence of this is dramatically increasing. It's doubling still. It's worth noting that even if you take the ones without the secondary source, that number actually goes up from 12 a little bit higher, but nowhere near as high as 2023. 2023 has been absolutely insane. Remember, only one of these would be considered a scandal 10 years ago, like a serious scandal. But this is happening at such a rate that we need to have a serious conversation about this. The departments in our universities, they need to have a serious conversation about this. The public needs to have a serious conversation about this. Are our public universities ours? Are they academic institutions? Are they places that people can trust to go to? Are they post-academic institutions where they basically are the skin suit? But in addition, if you're thinking about tenure track, same thing here. Same thing here. So I thought for a couple applications in my data set, I would try out just to see just the prominence of this. So here, for instance, I look at Maclean's computer science program. So Maclean's is very commonly used to see popular programs, and students often look at these lists to see which universities maybe they should register at. And these are often considered some of the top schools. I looked at how many participating in die pledges or preferential hiring. I seen that it was at least 75% in my data set. That's not small. Also, I looked at the U15. The U15 is actually a group of universities. This is the list of those universities. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to list them because it doesn't matter very much. Just know that it is a conglomerate of a lot of top universities that do a lot of research. Many of these universities teach almost like about half of all the graduate students that come out of these schools overall the whole country. So how many of these participate or engage in these practices? At least 80% according to my research. Also, the U15 actually acknowledges the issue of brain drain. This is one that I'm concerned about because that's number 3. That's number 3. That's the yellow dot. Well, U15 seems to have an ideological blind spot. They recognize the notion of brain drain, and they see it as an issue of needing more funding. But they also think that it's very important that DIE is a part of this. So I see this as a blind spot that many leadership positions at the U15 or at other universities seem to be missing, is that ultimately they're culling qualified applicants because they simply just have other views on DIE. They may have different inclusive views on how they carry out their work. Maybe they're just an academic. So there's major concerns of academic culling. First, there's the further decline of institutional trust. Institutional trust in many polls has been going down. The other concern is normalization. So one thing I've been noticing alongside this is the increase of DIE pledges is also coming along with some universities starting to impose these types of trainings on faculty and even students. So this is the normalization phrase. Some people might know this from the topic of ideological subversion. That's what I'm referring to here. This is one serious concern. Ultimately, there's the concern of lowering academic standards in teaching and potential current concerns about research, as I discussed earlier. So ultimately, there's issues of brain drain, and ultimately, where are the scientists going to be that we can trust? The ones that are of the 3, the ones that respect academic principles. Where are they? And the ones that act on academic principles. That's the thing that makes number 3 very different, the yellow dot. Where are they? Are they inside, outside the institutions? So here's some thoughts for you. I suggest you figure it out for yourself. I don't want to give you any ideas of how you might proceed with the data I have given you and the results I presented and some of the ideas we discussed. I want you to think about this for yourself, come to your own conclusions, review strategic plans of your local university, and ask yourself, does this look like a public academic university? Most universities will have this publicly available. I suggest you review it and see if it resembles something that you think would be such a thing. Consider alternatives or demand better. Like if you think that the universities are failing at their mission, you should let them know. If you're an alum, write open letters. Tell your friends. Or even then, if you don't really like what's going on there, if you donate to them, don't donate. It's not very complicated. Consider alternatives. There's so many young minds in this country that go to university because they're told that that's where they have to go. There's so many other ways that you can succeed in life than going to university, and I suggest that people start considering that too. There's also other places that are growing, islands of academic freedom, where people are trying to build them within the institutions and outside the institutions, and we want to encourage these places too, so that they can grow too. But ultimately, demand what is expected. So if you're an academic, your job is to make sure you're maintaining academic principles. If you have to show that the students, the public, what academics are supposed to do. They're supposed to uphold standards. This should be applicable for all academics. So I use the analogy of chefs and academics. So if you wouldn't go to a restaurant at a chef that would just simply make people sick, right? Academics need to uphold, just like chefs, they have to uphold principles and standards. So think of any cuisine you can think of, like Italian or Chinese or like any typical American bistro kind of chef. All sorts of things. I love food. The thing is, they all take time to delicately craft their cuisine. It's all about quality over quantity. If they're a good chef, they always have key principles. And all I'm saying is academics need to start considering the fact that they need to consider that they have to uphold principles and standards. They can't just continue to just look at the ground and say, well, if I just don't do anything, something else might happen. Well, that's not working out. I've spoken to academics that have this mentality, and I think that they need to start looking inwards as opposed to thinking that it'll just go away. So these are my possible calls of action. First, exercise academic freedom. Do not be afraid to use academic freedom. Poor ideas need sharpening. So talk to people. Expect institutional neutrality of public universities. Place pressure on them to improve. Organize and innovate. So form student, faculty, and public groups and new academic institutions and businesses. Do what I'm trying to do. Try to form new islands for academic freedom, because right now we're not in a very good place for that. Better data acquisition. I spent years trying to do this, and my concern is it's going to get even harder. We need more researchers studying this topic. And I suggest you do not recommend unprincipled schools. Do not donate to them. Just to be very clear, do not do it. So that is up to you to decide, as per our previous discussion on the previous couple slides. Of concern for the general public, I suggest, if you feel that this is of serious concern, contact your provincial or federal government representatives and ask them to ban ideological litmus tests. So that's die pledges, any ideological litmus test. So this will cover any potential wiggling of these terms. Remember, like how I told you that these terms are very ambiguous? The die terms are very ambiguous. They'll simply just redefine them in another way. I suggest you just ban them all outright. So require much higher thresholds as well for permitting application of special hiring programs. It is my opinion, you don't have to agree with it. I believe that the thresholds for these are way too low. They allow them to be used for ideological purposes as opposed to for genuine cases. Finally, remove die program items from public funding agencies. So NSERC, HQP requirements, get rid of all of them. They don't need to be there. That's not important for science. This is an ideological pressure on the institutions. We need to get rid of them. To make a more inclusive university is to get rid of barriers. I'm suggesting we get rid of barriers. That being said, thank you very much, and have yourself a beautiful day.